It did have considerable effect of a most unfortunate kind for us. It awaked the enemy to instant appreciation of the fact that it was essential for him to hold that ground, and that it behooved him to take it before we brought up any more force. A military lesson is to be learned from the result, to wit, that dangers lurk in excess of enterprise as well as in its deficiency. In this campaign, our cavalry affords two instances. Stuart's zeal, without necessity, led him to make the circuit of McClellan's army, June 11th, 15. The result was that McClellan was prepared to change his base to the James as soon as he found Lee threatening his communications. Now, the temptation to shell a camp and wagon trains loses to our army its last chance to take a position which would compel the enemy to assume the offensive. One howitzer could, of course, accomplish nothing but to alarm the enemy and precipitate their attack. When Stuart opened fire, he thought that both Longstreet and Jackson were near. In fact, neither was within miles. Jackson had been sent in direct pursuit, being nearest the most direct roads, and his troops having been least engaged during the 7 days. 2 of the 4 brigades of his own division had been so little exposed as to have had together but 2 killed and 26 wounded in the whole campaign. His 3D brigade, Winder's, had had but 75 casualties at Gaines' Mill and 104 at Malvern. Lawton's brigade and Ewell's and Whiting's divisions had only been severely engaged at Gaines' Mill. Longstreet, with A.P. Hill's and his own divisions, was on the Sude moved around the field of battle to Poindexter's house, and on the Threed was sent by Rhodes to the left of Jackson. By mistake of the guides, he was conducted too far to the left, and only reached Evelington Heights about dark on the 3rd. Jackson's troops came up at the same time by the direct road. Jackson's official report says, "On the morning of the 3rd, my command arrived near the landing and drove in the enemy's skirmishers, but the date is shown by all other reports to be a clerical error for the 4th. Had Stuart not opened fire, the enemy would not have disturbed him that day." During it, McClellan wrote to the Secretary of War as follows: "I am in hopes the enemy is as completely worn out as we are. He was certainly very severely punished in the last battle. The roads are now very bad. For these reasons, I hope we shall now have enough breathing space to reorganize and rest the men and get them into position before the enemy can attack again. It is, of course, impossible to estimate as yet our losses, but I doubt whether there are today more than 50,000 men with their colours." By the next morning, 21 Confederate brigades had arrived and would have been upon Evelington Heights had Stuart not forced the enemy to come over and occupy them. McClellan's 50,000 men would then have had the task of removing them. Stuart thus describes his resistance: "I held the ground from 9 a.m. till 2 p.m., when the enemy had contrived to get one battery into position on this side the creek. The fire was, however, kept up until a body of infantry was found approaching by our right flank. I had no apprehension, however, as I felt sure Longstreet was nearby, and although Pelham had but 2 rounds of ammunition left, I held out, knowing how important it was to hold the ground till Longstreet arrived. The enemy's infantry advanced, and his battery kept up its fire. I just then learned that Longstreet had taken the wrong road and was then at Nance's shop, 6 or 7 miles off. Pelham fired his last round, and the sharpshooters, strongly posted in the skirt of woods bordering the plateau, exhausted every cartridge, but had at last to retire. The next day, July 4th, General Jackson's command drove in the enemy's advanced pickets. I pointed out the position of the enemy, now occupying, apparently in force, the plateau from which I shelled their camp the day before, and showed him the routes by which the plateau could be reached to the left, and submitted my plan for dispossessing the enemy and attacking his camp. This was subsequently laid before the commanding general. From the Federal reports, it appears that the enemy occupied the heights on the afternoon of July 3rd with Franklin's division. The next morning, Longstreet was up with his own and A.P. Hill's division and 2 brigades of Magruder's. Jackson was also up with his own, Ewell's, Whiting's, and D.H. Hill's divisions. Lee did not reach the field until noon, and, as Longstreet ranked Jackson, he ordered the enemy's pickets driven in and preparation made for an attack. a favourable opportunity was presented to regain the Evelington heights by main force. They were occupied by but one division, and being across Herring Creek from the rest of the Federal Army, it could not have been rapidly reinforced. There would have been very small risk in making the effort so earnestly urged by Stuart, for McClellan would never have dared a counterstroke had we failed. The enemy's gunboats could have rendered little assistance, as their own camps and lines intervened. Briefly, the game seems to have been worth the candle, and it should have been played. Jackson's troops, however, were in front, and Jackson protested against the attack, saying that the troops were not in proper condition, and asking for delay until Lee should reach the field. To this Longstreet consented, and when Lee arrived, Jackson's arguments prevailed, and the attack was given up. It was entirely unlike Lee, and he must have reluctantly yielded to Jackson's persuasion. Evidently, Jackson was still not the Jackson of the Valley. The next day, the troops were moved back toward Richmond, and the campaign was ended. The total casualties of the two armies for the 7 days were, including the Federal wounded, we took about 10,000 prisoners and captured 52 guns and about 35,000 muskets. We lost 2 guns in the stampede in Holmes's division. For a week after McClellan had established himself at Westover, he neglected to occupy the opposite bank of the James. As the fire of his gunboats commanded it, he could do so at pleasure, but as long as he did not, it was much better for us that he should not. Again, however, the temptation to shell a camp proved irresistible, and Lee was persuaded to authorize an expedition for the purpose under Pendleton's supervision. On July 12th, some 47 rifled guns were collected, positions chosen, and ranges marked for night firing. After midnight, they opened fire upon the Federal transports, wharves, and camps, and used up their small supplies of ammunition in a random cannonade. The enemy replied in like fashion, both from the shore and from gunboats. Of course, there was much commotion in the Federal camps, but the actual damage done was trifling. Some 40 casualties are reported among the Federals, and 2 or 3 among the Confederate artillerists. The next day, the Federals established themselves on the south side. The strategic advantages of a position astraddle of the James River have already been referred to, page 61, chapter 3. But they were not yet generally appreciated. Fortunately for us, Lincoln and Halleck recalled McClellan and his army to Washington without ever realizing them, although McClellan had tried hard to impress them upon his superiors. Fortunately, too, for us, General S.G. French, in command at Petersburg, saw and appreciated the threat of the position, and immediately began the construction of a line of entrenchments about that city. These entrenchments, in 1864, defeated some attempts at surprise, and at last enabled Beauregard, with 2 divisions, to withstand the attack of Grant's whole army between June 15th and 18th of that year. My personal duties during the 7 days were the supervision and distribution of our ammunition supplies. Our organized division supply trains and brigade wagons worked smoothly, and no scarcity was felt anywhere. In addition to these duties, I was placed in charge of a balloon which had been manufactured in Savannah by Dr. Edward Cheves and sent to General Lee for use in reconnoitring the enemy's lines. It was made from silk of many patterns, varnished with gutta-percha car springs dissolved in naphtha, and inflated at the Richmond gas works with ordinary city gas. I saw the Battle of Gaines' Mill from it, and signalled information of the movement of Slocum's division across the Chickahominy to reinforce Porter. Ascensions were made daily, and when the enemy reached Malvern Hill, the inflated balloon would be carried down the river and ascensions made from the deck of a boat. Unfortunately, on July 4th, the boat, the Teaser, a small armed tug, got aground below Malvern Hill on a falling tide, and a large Federal gunboat, the Maritanza, came up and captured both boat and balloon, the crew escaping. We could never build another balloon, but my experience with this gave me a high idea of the possible efficiency of balloons in active campaigns. Especially did we find, too, that the balloons of the enemy forced upon us constant troublesome precautions in efforts to conceal our marches. As affording a bird's-eye view of our organisation and of the forces engaged in the different actions and the severity of the conflicts, a table of Confederate division casualties is attached, showing as accurately as can be determined the losses of each command for each action. The total Federal losses in killed and wounded, excluding prisoners, is also approximately divided for the principal actions as nearly as records permit. Chapter 10. Cedar Mountain. The close of the 7 days found both armies greatly in need of rest. Lincoln called upon the governors of the northern states for 300,000 more men, and bounties, state and federal, were offered to secure them rapidly. They were easily obtained, but a mistake was made in putting the recruits in the field. They were organized into entirely new regiments, which were generally hurried to the field after but little drilling and training. President Davis also called for conscripts, all that could be gotten. No great number were obtained, for those arriving at the age of conscription usually volunteered in some selected regiment. Those who were conscripted were also distributed among veteran regiments to repair the losses of the campaign, and this was done as rapidly as the men could be gotten to the front. Although this method allowed no time for drill or training, yet it was far more effective in maintaining the strength of the army than the method pursued by the Federals. During the short intermission from active operations, something was accomplished, too, to improve our organizations, though leaving us still greatly behind the example long before set us by the enemy. Longstreet and Jackson were still but major generals commanding divisions, but each now habitually commanded other divisions besides his own, called a wing, and the old divisions became known by the names of new commanders. Thus, Jackson's old division now became Taliaferro's, and Longstreet's division became Pickett's, while Longstreet and Jackson each commanded a wing, so-called. It was not until another brief rest in October, after the Battle of Sharpsburg, that Longstreet and Jackson were made lieutenant generals, and the whole army was definitely organized into corps. Some improvement was also made in our armament by the guns and rifled muskets captured during the 7 days, and my reserve ordnance train was enlarged. Lines of light earthworks were constructed, protecting Chaffin's Bluff batteries on the James River, and stretching across the peninsula to connect with the lines already built from the Chickahominy to the head of White Oak Swamp. General D.H. Hill also constructed lines on the south side of the James, protecting Drury's Bluff and Richmond from an advance in that quarter, and General French at Petersburg, as already mentioned, threw lines around that city, from the river below to the river above. Just at the beginning of the 7 days' battles, President Lincoln had called from the West Magi General John Pope, and placed him in command of the 3 separate armies of Fremont and Banks in the Valley of Virginia, and McDowell near Fredericksburg. The union of the 3 into one was a wise measure, but the selection of a commander was as eminently unwise. One from the army in Virginia, other things being equal, would have possessed many advantages, and there was no lack of men of far sounder reputation than Pope had borne among his comrades in the old U.S. Army. He had spent some years in Texas boring for artesian water on the Staked Plains, and making over-sanguine reports of his prospects of success. An army song had summed up his reputation in a brief parody of some well-known lines. Hope told a flattering tale, as follows. Pope told a flattering tale, which proved to be bravado, about the streams which spout like ale on the Llano Estacado. Pope arrived early in July and began to concentrate and organize his army. A characteristic, flattering tale is told in an address to his troops, July 14th, dated Headquarters in the Saddle. Let us understand each other. I come to you from the west, where we have always seen the backs of our enemies, from an army whose business it has been to seek the adversary and beat him when he was found, whose policy has been attack and not defence. I presume I have been called here to pursue the same system and to lead you against the enemy. Meantime, I desire you to dismiss from your minds certain phrases, which I am sorry to find so much in vogue amongst you. I hear constantly of taking strong positions and holding them, of lines of retreat, and of bases of supplies. Let us discard such ideas. Let us study the probable lines of retreat of our opponents and leave our own to take care of themselves. Success and glory are in the advance. Disaster and shame lurk in the rear. The arrogance of this address was not calculated to impress favourably officers of greater experience in actual warfare, who were now oversloughed by his promotion. McDowell would have been the fittest selection, but he and Banks, both seniors to Pope, submitted without a word, as did also Sumner, Franklin, Porter, Heintzelman, and all the major generals of McClellan's army. But Fremont protested, asked to be relieved, and practically retired from active service. Meanwhile, after the discomfiture of McClellan, Mr. Lincoln felt the want of a military adviser, and, on July 11th, appointed General Halleck Commander-in-Chief of all the armies of the United States, and summoned him to Washington City. Pope's story of the Civil War thus comments upon this appointment. It is easy to see how this unfortunate selection came to be made. Halleck was at that time the most successful general in the Federal service. It was perfectly natural that he should be the choice of the President and Secretary of War, to whom his serious defects as a military man could not have become known. His appointment was also satisfactory to the public, for as so much had been effected under his command in the West, he was generally credited with great strategic ability. But both the people and the President were before long to find out how slender was Halleck's intellectual capacity, how entirely unmilitary was the cast of his mind, and how repugnant to his whole character was the assumption of any personal and direct control of an army in the field. Halleck arrived in Washington and took charge on July 22nd. He found, awaiting for his decision, a grave problem. It was whether McClellan's army, now entrenched at Westover on the James, should be heavily reinforced and allowed to enter upon another active campaign from that point as a base, or whether it should abandon the James River entirely and be brought back by water to unite with the army now under Pope in front of Washington. McClellan earnestly begged for reinforcements and confidently predicted success if they were given him. He had begun to appreciate the strategic advantages of his position, and he was even proposing as his first movement the capture of Petersburg by a coup de main. This would not have been, at that time, a difficult operation. McClellan had 90,000 men available, for he could have even abandoned his position on the north side and used his whole force. As to its effect, it would probably have finally compelled the evacuation of Richmond, as it did in 1865. Had McClellan possessed enterprise and audacity, he would have waited neither for permission nor reinforcements, but have made the dash on his own responsibility as soon as he found that there was serious thought of recalling his army. All of this time, however, McClellan was still representing to his government that Lee had 200,000 men. If he really believed this, it is not strange that he kept closely within his entrenchments, but Mr. Ropes, the most careful historian of the war, asserts that neither McClellan nor Halleck believed this preposterous story. McClellan told it and stuck to it, trying to scare the administration into giving him unlimited reinforcements. But his real belief, Mr. Ropes thinks, is apparent in his offer to undertake the new campaign with only 20,000 reinforcements, raising his force to only 110,000. Mr. Ropes says that Halleck saw and appreciated McClellan's insincerity, but, wishing to have the army brought back, he affected to believe in the 200,000 men, and easily confounded McClellan's arguments by pointing out what such a force might do under such generals as Lee and Jackson. Halleck had visited McClellan on the James soon after his arrival in Washington, and the matter was argued, pro and con, in correspondence afterward for some weeks. McClellan ended with a strong appeal, pointing out that he could deliver his battle within 10 miles of Richmond, which was the heart of the Confederacy, while a victory 70 miles off might count for little. Halleck answered that it was unsafe to have a divided army in the face of Lee's force, that the location on the James River was very unhealthy in the fall months, and that most of McClellan's leading generals favoured the withdrawal of the army. So orders were given, and the Federal Army, on August 14, began the evacuation of the only position from which it could soon have forced the evacuation of Richmond. They were only to find it again after 2 years' fighting, and the loss of over 100,000 men, and they would find it then only by being defeated upon every other possible line of advance. The army was marched to Fortress Monroe, whence, as rapidly as boats could be furnished, it was carried up the Potomac to Aquia Creek or Alexandria. Thence each corps, as fast as it arrived, was marched to join Pope's army, it being designed to concentrate everything behind the Rappahannock. Now let us turn to Lee, and see how he met the difficulties of his situation and what fortune attended his efforts. He realized that the immediate danger was that McClellan should be reinforced and renew his campaign from his new base. The first solicitude was to have McClellan's army recalled. Some early efforts were made to demoralize the transport vessels on the James, by which the army was supplied. Light guns were sent to various points along the river, whence they could, as it were, ambush passing vessels and fire upon them. But the Federal gunboats had soon learned the danger points and how to protect transports passing them, and no serious result could be accomplished. There were, however, persistent rumours that the Confederates were constructing one or more ironclads at Richmond, which would soon come down the James and destroy the whole Federal fleet. The uneasiness caused in Washington by these rumours may have contributed to the result finally reached, but Lee could not afford to wait at Richmond for the enemy to make up his mind slowly. His only chance was to strike Pope's army before it could be joined by McClellan's. As early, therefore, as July 13th, he had ordered Jackson, with Taliaferro's and Ewell's divisions, to Gordonsville, to oppose reported advances of Pope. The latter had, on July 14th, ordered General Hatch to seize Gordonsville, then held by only about 200 infantry and a few cavalry. Hatch, however, lost time by listening to false reports that the Confederates were near at hand, and by waiting to take infantry, artillery, and a wagon train, along with the considerable cavalry force which Pope had intended should alone be used. It alone would have been ample, as Jackson's troops did not reach Gordonsville until July 19th. Hatch's expedition, therefore, was a failure. Jackson, on his arrival, was anxious to undertake some aggressive operation against Pope, but found his force, only about 12,000 men, inadequate to accomplish anything against Pope's 47,000. So he appealed to Lee for reinforcement. Not yet assured that McClellan would not soon resume the offensive, Lee hesitated, but on July 27th ordered A.P. Hill's division, about 12,000 strong, to Gordonsville. Hill joined Jackson on August 2. Meanwhile, Pope had received instructions from Halleck to make demonstrations toward Gordonsville, with the view of occupying Lee's attention and preventing his interference with the contemplated withdrawal of McClellan's force from the peninsula. On August 6, Pope began to cross his infantry over the Rappahannock to concentrate about Culpeper. With swift appreciation of the opportunity, Jackson, on the 7th, put his whole force in motion to fall upon that portion of the enemy which first reached Culpeper. Could he defeat one of Pope's 3 corps and occupy that central position in time, he might deal with the other 2 in succession, as he had dealt with Shields and Fremont at Port Republic. His strategy was excellent, but it was defeated by his own logistics. On the 7th, the march was but 8 miles, having only been begun in the afternoon. On the 8th, there were 20 miles to go to reach Culpeper, with the Rapidan and Robertson rivers to ford, the latter river being held by the Federal cavalry, about 12 miles in front of the town. The weather was intensely hot, and it could hardly be expected that the Confederates would make the march in time to give battle on the same day. It would have been, however, only an easy march to reach a point, so close to the enemy, that battle could be delivered at an early hour on the 9th, allowing time to reap the fruits of victory, if successful. But on the 8th, some little blunders and omissions in giving the orders to the 3 divisions utterly confounded the march, and the head of the column only made 8 miles, and the rear of it but 2. In the first place, each division was allowed to take its own wagon train behind it on the road, instead of concentrating all 3 into one train behind the whole force. In the next place, Ewell's division, which was to lead and be followed by Hill's, had its route changed without Hill's being informed. This led to delay on Hill's part, and to Jackson's division, now commanded by Winder, getting ahead. Winder presently found his line of march intersected by Ewell's. It was also charged that Hill showed little zeal, being offended that Jackson, with his usual reticence, had given him no information of his plans. Lee, indeed, in a recent letter had given Jackson a hint that his reticence might be carried too far. He had said, "A.P. Hill, you will, I think, find a good officer with whom you can consult, and by advising with your division commanders as to your movements, much trouble will be saved you in arranging details, and they can aid more intelligently." The whole incident shows that our staff service was poorly organised and not efficient in its operations. The result of all this delay was that it was about 3 p.m. on the 9th before Ewell's division on the right and Winder's on the left had formed line in front of Banks's corps, which had been encountered at Cedar Mountain, some 7 miles south of Culpeper. Lawton's large brigade of Ewell's division and Gregg's of Hill's division had been left behind to guard the wagon trains against the enemy's superior force of cavalry. The remainder of Hill's division was not yet up, and, while waiting their arrival, 26 rifled guns were brought up by Jackson and opened upon the enemy's lines and batteries. The left of Winder's division rested along the front edge of a considerable body of wood, which had not been thoroughly examined. Pope, in his report, asserts that Banks had been ordered to take a strong position and hold it, awaiting reinforcements, which were rapidly coming up. This should have been his play, but Pope had used expressions in orders sent by his chief of cavalry, which Banks understood as permission to attack if the enemy were not in great force. Being personally both brave and aggressive, Banks thought the opportunity had arrived, and before Jackson was ready to advance, between 5 and 6 p.m., he attacked with his whole force. The right of his line overlapped the left of Winder's division, and taking it in flank and pressing vigorously, it entirely routed the left brigade under Garnett, and threw the whole division into much confusion. Winder himself had been killed by a cannon shot in the preliminary artillery fighting. Just at this juncture, however, Hill's division arrived upon the field, and not only restored the battle, but drove the enemy from the field and across Cedar Creek, a short distance in rear. By this time it was about dark, but Jackson was determined to lose no possible chance. Favoured by a moon but little past the full, he brought forward 2 fresh brigades, Field's and Stafford's, and Pegram's battery, crossed the creek and continued the pursuit. Banks's corps, however, had, in its retreat, met Ricketts's division of McDowell's corps, accompanied by Pope in person, and followed also by the leading troops of Sigel's corps. About 1.5 miles beyond Cedar Creek, the Confederate advance found itself close in front of a strong line of battle, composed of Ricketts's 4 brigades, with 4 batteries of artillery. Pegram's 4 guns were pushed to the front, and, at close canister range, opened upon the enemy. They were replied to by a dozen guns, but continued the action until they were practically cut to pieces. It was now nearly midnight, and Jackson, having learned from the cavalry of the capture of prisoners from Sigel's corps, was constrained to halt for the night. By morning he found that the greater part of Pope's army was now united in his front, and that his opportunity to attack the enemy in detail had passed, lost by the bad marching on the 8th. He still, however, felt able to defeat them if they could be induced to attack him in position, as Pope was pledged to do in his Order 75. So he withdrew his line across the creek and occupied himself in gleaning the battlefield of arms. Pope showed too much wisdom to accept the gauge of further battle. Heavy reinforcements were coming to him, and it was as clearly his game to await their arrival as it had been Jackson's to anticipate it. So, on the 11th, he sent in a flag of truce asking permission to bury his dead of the 9th, which were still within Jackson's lines. It was granted until noon, and then extended until sundown. On the 12th, finding that Pope would not be tempted to attack him there, he tried another ruse. He fell back from the battlefield, not only to the south side of the Rapidan, where he might easily have halted and maintained himself, but he continued his retreat through Orange CH and on to Gordonsville. He hoped that Pope would construe the move as a confession of weakness and would be inspired by it and his own boastings to follow. This strategy was very nearly successful. On Oct. 12, Pope, having heard that the reinforcements under Burnside would soon join him, wired Halleck that, on their arrival, he would cross the Rapidan and advance upon Louisa CH. This would have given the Confederates the very opportunity desired. On August 13, Lee had ordered Longstreet and Hood, with 12 brigades, to proceed by rail to Gordonsville, and on the 14th he also ordered up Anderson's division of infantry, 3 brigades, and Stuart's cavalry. On the 15th he went up in person and took the command. The casualties at Cedar Mountain had been as follows. The Confederate losses were distributed among 9 brigades of infantry and 1 of cavalry, and were greatest in Garnett's and Taliaferro's of Jackson's division, slightly over 300 in each. The Federal losses were in 8 brigades of infantry and 1 of cavalry. Crawford's brigade lost 857, Geary's 465, Prince's 452, and Gordon's 344. The fighting upon Jackson's left, where Garnett's and Taliaferro's brigades were broken by the charge of Crawford's and Gordon's brigades, and the line re-established by Branch's, Archer's, and Winder's brigades, was very desperate, as is shown by the casualties of some of the Federal regiments. An incident of the battle was a charge upon Taliaferro's brigade by 2 squadrons of the 1st PR Cav under Magee Falls, when the brigade, in some disorder, was pressing hard upon the retreat of the Federal infantry. The charge successfully rode through the Confederate skirmish line, but was driven back by the fire of the line of battle with the loss of 93 men out of 164. Jenon Williams, in his official report, says, "The 3-Dier Wizast especially fell under a partial flank fire from the underbrush and woods, which swept its right companies with great destruction, and under which Lieutenant Colin Crane fell pierced with several fatal wounds, and the regiment was obliged to give way. The enemy was, however, driven out of the open field by the other regiments and some distance into the woods, where, being strongly reinforced, their fire became overwhelming. No better proof of its terrific character can be given than the fact that of the 3 remaining regiments which continued the charge, 28th NY, 46th PAOS, and 5th Con, every field officer and every adjutant was killed or disabled. In the 28th NY, every company officer was killed or wounded. In the 26th PA, all but 5, and in the 5th Con, all but 8. A combat more persistent or heroic can scarcely be found in the history of the war, but men, even of this unequalled heroism, could not withstand the overwhelming numbers of the enemy, especially when left without the encouragement and direction of officers." Chapter 11. Second Manassas. Jenon Lee had arrived at Gordonsville early on August 15 and taken command. On the 13th, McClellan had abandoned his camp at Harrison's Landing and marched for Fortress Monroe. Lee now left at Richmond but 2 brigades of infantry to protect the city against cavalry raids, and took the rest of his army to the vicinity of Gordonsville for an aggressive campaign against Pope. He now occupied interior lines between McClellan and Pope, and it behooved him to crush Pope before McClellan's forces could join him. Lee understood this thoroughly, and Halleck and Pope understood it equally well. But Pope, perhaps inspired by his own boast that he was about to seek the adversary and beat him when he was found, and tempted also by Jackson's retreat from Cedar Mountain, had decided to cross the Rapidan and advance upon Louisa CH. Nothing could have suited Lee's plans better, but Halleck had not taken entire leave of his senses, and he no sooner heard of Pope's design to cross the Rapidan than he promptly forbade it. He also, in another letter, told Pope that he had much better be north of the Rappahannock. Lee's idea of the game the Federals should have played was to retreat to the north side of Bull Run. Pope's army had now been reinforced by Burnside and numbered about 52,000 men. Its left flank rested near Raccoon Ford of the Rapidan, some 4 miles east of Mitchell Station on the O&ARR. His centre was at Cedar Mountain, and his right on Robertson's River, about 5 miles west of the railroad. He was, therefore, directly opposite Gordonsville, where Jackson's forces had arrived on the 13th. About 2 miles below Rapidan Station was a high hill called Clark's Mountain, close to the Rapidan, and giving from its top an extensive view of the flat lands of Culpeper across the river. A signal station was maintained there, and from it the white tents of the Federal camps, marking out their positions, were plainly visible. Spurs of Clark's Mountain, running parallel to the Rapidan, extended eastward down the river about 3 miles, to the vicinity of a ford called Somerville's, 2 miles above Raccoon Ford. Raccoon Ford was within 10 miles of Culpeper C.H., almost as near it as the position of Pope's army. Lee, on arriving about 8 a.m. on the 15th, and learning the details of the situation, lost no time. The topography gave him a beautiful opportunity to mass his army, now about 54,000 men, behind Clark's Mountain, to cross at Somerville Ford, fall upon Pope's left flank and sweep around it with a superior force, cutting off Pope's retreat to Washington. Probably at no time during the war was a more brilliant opportunity put so easily within his grasp. He appreciated it, and promptly issued the necessary orders on the very day of his arrival. His army, however, was not yet sufficiently well organized to be called a military machine, or to be relied upon to carry out orders strictly. On the contrary, in some respects it might be called a very unmilitary machine, as the history of the failure in this case will illustrate. Lee, in his report, tells the story very briefly. He says, "The movement, as explained in the accompanying order, was appointed for August 18. But the necessary preparations not having been completed, its execution was postponed until the 20th. This postponement was the fatal act, for on the 18th the enemy discovered his danger, and in great haste put his army in motion to the rear, and fell back behind the Rappahannock during that day and the next. The principal failure in the preparations was the non-arrival of Fitz-Lee's brigade of cavalry at the appointed rendezvous at Verdiersville, near Raccoon Ford, where it was to cross on the morning of the 18th to act upon the right flank of the army. Its commander had duly received orders from Stuart, but had taken the liberty to delay their execution for a day, not supposing that it would make any material difference. Stuart's report gives the following details. On August 16, 1862, in pursuance of the commanding general's secret instructions, I put this brigade, Fitz-Lee's, on the march for the vicinity of Raccoon Ford, near which point the army under General Lee's command was rapidly concentrating. General Fitzhugh Lee was directed by me to proceed the next day from near Davenport's Bridge, opposite Beaver Dam, across to the vicinity of Raccoon Ford, where I promised to join him on that evening, 17th. I proceeded on the cars directly to the commanding general, whom I found near Orange C.H. After dark on the 17th, Stuart arrived at Verdierville with his staff, having ridden from Orange C.H., but to his surprise could find or hear nothing of Fitz-Lee's brigade. As it was highly important to communicate with it, he dispatched a staff officer on the road by which the brigade was expected to find it. Unfortunately, he selected his adjutant general, Major Fitzhugh, who carried Stuart's copy of Lee's order of the 15th, disclosing his plan. This was careless practice, and some blame must also rest upon Stuart for not having given his orders to Fitz-Lee so explicitly that the latter could neither misunderstand or disobey them, for the latter had deliberately marched on the 17th from near Davenport's Bridge to Louisa C.H., instead of to Verdiersville, as ordered. These 3 points are very nearly at the angles of an equilateral triangle, with sides of about 20 miles each. Taking his route by Louisa not only occupied 2 days, but so exhausted his horses that a 3rd day was required to rest them before the proposed movement could be begun. Fitz-Lee made no official report, but in his Life of General Lee refers to this occasion as follows. The brigade commander, Fitz-Lee Stuart, had expected at Verdiersville, did not understand from any instructions he had received that it was necessary to be at this point on that particular afternoon, and had marched a little out of his direct road in order to reach his wagons and get from them a full supply of rations and ammunition. Such loose practices may occur 100 times without any serious result, but once in a while the fate of campaigns will be changed by them, and this was such an occasion. A scouting party of Federal cavalry had been sent across Raccoon Ford on the evening of the 17th, and, in the darkness of the night, Maggie Fitzhugh, searching for the lost brigade, rode into it and was captured. His copy of Lee's order was taken from him, and on the 18th was delivered to Pope. Meanwhile, Stuart and his staff had slept in the porch of a house at Verdierville, and in the morning had been surprised by the Federal scouting party. All managed to escape, but the enemy secured Stuart's cloak and plumed hat. But the end of the matter was not yet. When no cavalry appeared at Verdiersville, as expected on the night of the 17th, Longstreet ordered 2 regiments of infantry to be put on picket on the road to Raccoon Ford. The order was brought to Toombs's brigade, when he was absent, visiting a neighbouring brigadier. The senior colonel, however, sent out the regiments, and they were duly posted. Not long afterward, Toombs, returning, came upon the regiments, and finding them to be a part of his brigade, ordered them back to camp, claiming that no orders should be obeyed from superior officers which did not come through himself. Thus it had happened that the Federal scouting party got within our lines unannounced. When these facts were developed, Longstreet's adjutant in sword and sash was sent to place Toombs in arrest. He was afterward ordered to Gordonsville and to confine himself to the limits of the town. After a few days, however, he sent an apology and was restored to duty, followed the army, overtook it, and rejoined his brigade, to their great delight, on August 30, in the heat of the Battle of Second Manassas. When Lee learned of the absence of the cavalry, he at first proposed to defer the attack only a single day. Jackson is said to have urged that it would be best to make no delay at all, but to go ahead with the infantry. But the reports from the signal station on Clark's Mountain represented the enemy as quiet, and Lee decided to wait. Later, a telegraphic dispatch from Fitzhugh Lee representing his animals as in bad condition, it was decided to postpone the movement until the 20th, and orders were issued accordingly. Doubtless, Lee found it hard to believe that Pope, so soon after his boasting order, and still sooner after the victory he had claimed at Cedar Mountain, would now turn his back and fly without firing a shot. But later on that day, there came reports of activity and stir among the enemy's camps, and on the 19th Lee and Longstreet, going up the mountain to see for themselves, saw Pope's whole army march away to the Rappahannock. On the 20th, Lee's advance took place, but although the march was rapidly made in hopes of overtaking some delayed portion of the enemy, the hopes proved vain. On the north side of the Rappahannock, Pope found such advantages of position that, although for 5 precious days Lee sought diligently by feints and demonstrations to find a favourable opening, his efforts were vain. But to do nothing was to lose the campaign. By a bold raid of Stuart's, however, Lee now had the good luck to turn the tables and come into possession of Pope's private dispatch book, with copies of his most important correspondence with Lincoln, Halleck, and others. Stuart had gotten Lee's permission to try to burn a railroad bridge over Cedar Run, near Catlet Station, some 12 miles in rear of Pope's army. With about 1,500 cavalry and 2 guns, he crossed the Rappahannock at Waterloo Bridge, above Pope's right ank on August 22, and pushed on through Warrenton toward Catlet Station. A terrific rainstorm came on late in the ere noon, and in it the command captured the enemy's picket and surprised the Federal encampments. The night was memorable for black darkness, the time being just at the change of the moon. A Negro recognized Stuart and volunteered to lead him to the camp of Pope's staff and baggage. A regiment under W.H.F. Lee raided this camp, while other regiments raided other camps in the vicinity, and a force was sent to burn the bridge. This was impossible on account of the rain, the structure being a 2-story trestle. The party had no torpedoes, so a few axes were found, and all damage possible was done with them, but it was not serious. The storm which had prevented Stuart from burning the bridge and hastened his return also nipped in the bud aggressive operations by both commanders. Jackson, on Lee's LE, had crossed Early's brigade at Sulphur Springs, upon an old dam across the river, while his pioneers were repairing the broken bridge for a crossing in force. Pope, upon his own Lee, had designed to cross the Rappahannock and attack Lee's right flank. The freshet in the river not only called a halt upon both operations, but prevented all the Federal concentrations. Pope made a feeble effort to crush Early's brigade, but it was repulsed, and when a larger force had been brought up by the Federals, Early had withdrawn over the completed bridge. Meanwhile, the information gained from Pope's correspondence showed Lee that his campaign was to be an utter failure, unless, within the next 7 days, he could bring Pope to battle upon open ground. For already 2 of the corps of McClellan's army, the 30 and the 5th, and with Reynolds's PA. Reserves, in all 20,000 men, were within 2 days of juncture with Pope, and the Sode, 4th and 6th, with Sturgis's division, and Cox's 7,000 men from Kanawha could not be more than V days later. Lee had but about 55,000 men. In 2 days, Pope would have about 50,000, and in V days more he would have near 130,000. The situation was desperate, and it required a desperate remedy. 2 divisions of infantry, D.H. Hill's and McLaws's, 2 brigades under Walker, and a brigade of cavalry under Hampton, which altogether would raise Lee's force to 75,000, had been ordered up from Richmond, but could not be expected in time for the present emergency. Immediate action was necessary. It was taken with the quick decision characteristic of Lee. Jackson, with 3 divisions of infantry, 14 brigades about 22,000, and Stuart's cavalry, 2 brigades about 2,000, set out in light marching order, with no trains but ordnance, ambulances, and a few wagons with cooking utensils, by a roundabout march of over 50 miles, to fall upon Pope's depot of supplies at Manassas Junction, 24 miles in Pope's rear, and only 26 miles from Alexandria. Lee, with Longstreet and about 30,000 men, would hold the line of the Rappahannock and occupy Pope's attention, while Jackson was making his forced march. Lee's army, then, of 55,000, would be split in half, and Pope's army of about 80,000 would be about midway between the 2 halves. Any military student would pronounce such a situation absolutely ruinous to the divided army. In his History of the Civil War, Mr. Ropes writes of Lee's strategy. The disparity between Pope's force and that of Jackson is so enormous that it is impossible not to be amazed at the audacity of the Confederate general, in thus risking an encounter in which the very existence of Jackson's command would be imperilled, and to ask what was the object which General Lee considered as warranting such an extremely dangerous manoeuvre. The answer is not an easy one. We shall only remark here that this move of General Lee's in dividing his army was an illustration of the daring, not to say hazardous, policy which he pursued in this summer of 1862. The best answer is the one given by Lee himself, who is reported in Allen's Army of Northern Virginia to have said, in referring to some discussion of this matter, "Such criticism is obvious, but the disparity of force between the contending forces rendered the risks unavoidable." It was scarcely 60 days since Ives, as has been told, stopped his horse in the road to say to me, "If there is a man in either army, head and shoulders above all others in audacity, that man is Lee, and you will live to see it." There has been speculation whether this turning movement originated with Lee or Jackson. Lee's report only says, "In pursuance of the plan of operations determined upon, Jackson was directed on the 25th to cross above Waterloo, etc." Jackson's report says, "Pursuing the instructions of the commanding general, I le Jeffersonton on the morning of the 25th, etc." The most natural supposition would ascribe the plan to Lee. His own words would seem to confirm the supposition, and Jackson's form of expression to endorse it. Colgan Henderson, who would certainly assert a claim for Jackson if it were possible, has written, 1. It is only certain that we have record of few enterprises of greater daring than that which was there decided on. and no matter from whose brain it emanated, on Lee fell the burden of the responsibility. It is easy to conceive. It is less easy to execute, but to risk cause and country, name and reputation on a single throw, and to abide the issue with unflinching heart, is the supreme exhibition of the soldier's fortitude. Early on, August 25, Jackson set out upon what Henderson calls his most famous march. He marched 26 miles that day and bivouacked very late that night at Salem. His course was first northwest to Amisville and thence about north to Salem. As his march was intended to be a surprise, it had been favoured by the storm of the 2030. This tended to prevent large columns of dust, which so great a movement would surely have raised in dry weather. Considering the object of the march, it was a mistake to allow the infantry regiments to carry their banners displayed. For the country was moderately flat, and was dominated on the east by the Bull Run Mountains, upon which it was to be expected the enemy would have scouts and signal stations. This was actually the case, and the march of the column was observed by 8 a.m. on the 25th, and it was watched for 15 miles, and fair estimates were made of its strength from counting the regimental flags and the batteries. It was plainly seen that their immediate destination was Salem. This information was promptly communicated to Pope, Halleck, and the leading generals, who began to guess what the movement meant. Naturally, no one guessed correctly, for the simple reason that no one could imagine that Lee would deliberately place his army in a position where Pope could deal with the two halves of it separately. It was correctly guessed that the troops marching to Salem were Jackson's, but Pope supposed them to be on their way to the valley and probably covering the Ankh of Lee's main body, which might be on their LE moving upon Front Royal. He has been justly blamed for not ordering a strong reconnaissance to develop the true state of affairs. His proper move at the time, as indeed it had been for some days, was to fall back with his whole army to Manassas. He would perhaps have done this, but that Halleck had ordered him to hold especially the lower Rappahannock, covering Falmouth, and to fight like the devil. On the 26th, Jackson marched at dawn, and now the head of his column was turned to the east, and his men knew where they were going. In front of them was Orifair Gap through the Bull Run Mountains, which debouched upon the heart of the enemy's territory, held by 6 times their numbers. A march of about 20 miles brought Jackson to Gainesville on the Warrenton and Alexandria Pike by mid-air noon. Here he was overtaken by Stuart with the cavalry. These had skirmished at Waterloo Bridge all day of the 25th, and marched at 2 a.m. on the 26th to follow Jackson's route. Near Salem, finding the roads blocked by Jackson's artillery and trains, they had leather roads, and with skillful guides had found passes through the Bull Run Mountains, without going through Orifair Gap. Here Jackson, instead of marching directly upon Manassas Junction, where Pope's depot of supplies was located, took the road to Bristow Station, 7 miles south of Manassas. There the railroad was crossed by Broad Run. Jackson designed to destroy the bridge and place a force in position to delay the enemy's approach, while he burned the supplies at Manassas. The head of Ewell's column reached Bristow about sunset, having marched about 25 miles. So far, during this whole day, no report of Jackson's march had reached the Federals. Now, a train of empty cars, running the gantlet of a hot ray and knocking some crosstees off the track, escaped going to Manassas and gave the alarm. While Ewell's division took position to hold off the enemy, General Trimble volunteered, with 2 regiments, the 21st Guiers and 21st NC, to march back and capture Manassas before it could be reinforced from Alexandria. Proceeding cautiously in line of battle, it was nearly midnight when these troops were red upon with artillery from the Manassas works. Losing only 15 wounded, they charged the lines and took them with 8 guns. Our cavalry, following the movement, gathered 300 prisoners. Next morning, Jackson came up with Taliaferro's and Hill's divisions at an early hour, and, about the same time, a Federal brigade, sent by rail from Alexandria, advanced from Bull Run in line of battle, expecting to drive off a raid of cavalry. Had the Confederates restrained their impatience and permitted the enemy to approach, the whole brigade might have been captured. But their artillery could not resist the temptation to open upon the unsuspecting advance, and it retreated so rapidly that, although it was pursued for some miles, its whole loss was but 135 killed and wounded, and 204 prisoners. The Federal General Taylor was killed. The Federal and Sutler's supplies stored at Manassas presented a sight to the ragged and half-starved Confederates, such as they had never before imagined. Not only were there acres of warehouses filled to overowing, but loaded cars covered about 2 miles of side tracks, and great quantities of goods were stacked in regular order in the open fields, under tarpaulin covers. The supplies embraced everything eatable, drinkable, wearable, or usable, and in immense profusion. During the day, Jackson turned his men loose to feast and help themselves. At night, air astonishing their palates with real coffee, with cheese, sardines and champagne, and improving their underwear, apparel and footgear, and elling their haversacks, the torch was systematically applied. When Pope next day looked upon the ashes, he must have felt that it was bad advice, when he said, "Let us study the probable lines of retreat of our opponents, and leave our own to take care of themselves." Meanwhile, at Bristow, Ewell had been unmolested until near 3 o'clock. About that time he was attacked by Hooker's division. This Pope had sent to develop the situation at Manassas, of which he was as yet not informed. Hooker had only about 5,500 men, less than Ewell had at hand, but his attack was so vigorous that the latter, whose orders were not to bring on a general engagement ere an hour's fighting, withdrew across Broad Run, having fought on the south side, and marched to join Jackson at Manassas without being followed. Jackson had now accomplished the RST object of his expedition, the destruction of the Manassas depot. Pope would have to abandon his line on the Rappahannock, and would, of course, move at once to crush Jackson. A Napoleon, in his place, might have cut loose from his base and marched upon Richmond, leaving Lee to wreck his army on the fortified lines around Washington. But Pope was no Napoleon. When he realized the situation, however, his RST orders were very judicious, a safer play if less brilliant than a Napoleonic advance upon Richmond would have been. He ordered the 2 corps of McDowell and Sigel with Reynolds's division, about 40,000 men, to Gainesville. In support of them, to Greenwich, he sent Heintzelman with 3 divisions. Hooker was sent to Bristow to attack Ewell, with Porter marching to support him. Banks, in the rear, protected the trains. The best part of all of these orders was the occupation of Gainesville with a strong force, for Gainesville was directly between Jackson and Longstreet. It behooved Pope to prevent any possible junction between these two, and now, on the night of the 27th at Gainesville, he held the key to the whole position. But, unfortunately for Pope, as yet he had no conception that Lee, with Longstreet's corps, would be hurrying to throw himself into the lion's den by the side of Jackson. He seems to have thought that his effort should be to bag Jackson, rather than to keep him from uniting with Lee. Let us now turn to Lee and Longstreet. On the 26th, Jackson having about a day and a half the start, Longstreet's corps set out to follow. One division, Anderson's, of 4 brigades, was at Lee at Sulphur Springs, in observation of the enemy, while the remaining 17 brigades, somewhat loosely organized into about V divisions, say 25,000 men, were put in motion to follow in Jackson's track. Lee rode with this command, and they bivouacked for the night near Orleans. At dawn on the 27th, the march was resumed. He was delayed at Salem by some cavalry demonstrations from the direction of Warrenton, and, having no cavalry, he went into bivouac at White Plains, having marched about 18 miles. I have already told of the course of events having been twice modified in this campaign, by the commanders coming into possession of their rivals' plans or orders, by virtue of some accident, and there is yet to tell of other similar occurrences. Besides these, there was also a narrow escape from capture by Lee himself. A Confederate quartermaster, on the morning of the 27th, was riding some distance ahead of Longstreet's column on the march northward from Orleans. Approaching Salem, he suddenly came upon the head of a Federal squadron. He turned and took to white, and the squadron, breaking into a gallop, pursued him. Within a short distance the fugitive came upon Lee with some 10 or 12 staff officers and couriers. He yelled out as he approached, "The Federal cavalry are upon you!" And almost at the same instant the head of the galloping squadron came into view, only a few hundred yards away. It was a critical moment, but the staff officers acted with good judgment. Telling the general to ride rapidly to the rear, they formed a line across the road and stood, proposing to delay the Federals until Lee could gain a safe distance. This regular formation deceived the enemy into the belief that it was the head of a Confederate squadron. They halted, gazed for a while, and then, wheeling about, turned back, never dreaming of the prize so near. On the night of the 27th, while Jackson is burning Manassas, Lee and Longstreet are in bivouac at White Plains, 24 miles west and beyond Orifair Gap, while McDowell, Sigel, and Reynolds are about Gainesville, directly between them. In this situation, the game is in Pope's hands, but, as already said, instead of trying to keep Lee and Jackson apart, his ambition is to make short work of Jackson, who, he probably supposed, would get in the earthworks around Manassas. In some such belief, during the night he issued further orders. All of his forces were ordered to march upon Manassas at dawn on the 28th. This is the order which lost Pope his campaign. It is now time to return to Jackson. He knew that Lee and Longstreet were coming, and his most obvious move, perhaps, would have been to march for Thoroughfare Gap by some route which would avoid McDowell at Gainesville. His movement, however, had not been made solely to destroy the depot at Manassas. That was but the first step necessary to get Pope out of his strong position. Now it was necessary to bring him to battle quickly, but in detail. His decision was a masterpiece of strategy, unexcelled during the war, and the credit of it seems solely due to Jackson himself. Soon after nightfall, Taliaferro's division was started on the road toward Sudley's ford of Bull Run, to cross the Warrenton Turnpike and bivouac in the woods north of Groveton. A.P. Hill's division was sent by the Blackburn's Ford Road to Centerville. After midnight, Ewell, who had arrived from Bristow and gotten some supplies, followed Hill across Bull Run. Then he turned up the stream and made his way on the north side to the Stone Bridge. This he crossed and made a junction with Taliaferro's division. Hill remained at Centerville until about 10 a.m., when he moved down the Warrenton Turnpike, also crossed at Stone Bridge, and, moving up towards Sudley, took position on Jackson's left. His march and Ewell's were each about 14 miles. The wagon trains all went with Taliaferro's division, which marched about 9 miles. The sending of 2 divisions across Bull Run was doubtless to be in position to interpose if Pope attempted to move past him toward Alexandria. Perhaps also it had in it the idea of misleading the enemy, for it certainly had that desirable effect. It happened that a part of Stuart's cavalry, which was on that flank during the morning, raided Burke's station on the railroad, only 12 miles from Alexandria. This, with the reported presence of Hill at Centerville, entirely misled Pope as to Jackson's true location. Early on the 28th, 2 Federal couriers were captured, bearing important orders. Those of the first were from McDowell to Sigel, directing him to march to Manassas Junction. This order was taken to Jackson, and he seems to have interpreted the movement to mean that Pope was about to retreat to Alexandria, for he at once sent orders to A.P. Hill at Centerville to move down to the fords of Bull Run to intercept the enemy. But fortunately, the other captured courier bore orders from Pope to McDowell, ordering the formation of his line of battle for the next day on Manassas Plains, and these orders, being brought to Hill, he appreciated that the enemy was not retreating, and that it would be dangerous to separate his division from the other 2. So, as has been told, about 10 a.m. he marched to join them. Though it was Jackson's desire now to conceal his whereabouts until Longstreet was near, yet one of his brigadiers, Colon Johnson, came near, bringing the force which was now marching from Gainesville toward Manassas, down upon the right flank of Taliaferro's and Ewell's divisions. Johnson, with 2 guns, was on a high hill, a little out from Jackson's extreme right. He saw the head of a column and skirmishers advancing, as he thought, upon his position. It was the head of Reynolds's division, on McDowell's left, straightening itself out for its prescribed march to Manassas, 10 miles to the southeast. Johnson opened fire upon them with his guns. The enemy promptly deployed his column, advanced skirmishers, and brought into action a superior force of artillery, on which Johnson abandoned his hill and withdrew his small force to Jackson's lines. The enemy's skirmishers advanced and occupied the hill, but the Confederate force was now nowhere to be seen. So it was supposed that the affair was only a demonstration by some reconnoitering party, and after caring for a few killed and wounded, the division marched for Manassas, where it was still supposed that Jackson was awaiting them.